So first thing first, on the bottom right you can see your URL. You will also see it at the end if you find anything interesting, which I hope. You can see the presentation online basically. And otherwise, thanks for showing up to my talk that I actually forgot to spell there, but you know what it's about. It's about 2D physics in Godot. So I'm Stephan, and you see our guy messing up my presentation, but I'm one half of Superputer Games, and commercially I'm also a UI UX designer. And I want to show you a small teaser beforehand so you can kind of get an idea of what our game is about. And you can feel special now because it's kind of technically a public reveal, so So when we describe our game, it's basically a mix between two ones of our childhood. So one is like the old school type Zelda game, so exploring a world, taking some quests, talking to NPCs, you know the drill. And the second one is actually probably even more important game of our childhood, which is called Loco Roco. But whenever we bring it up, nobody knows about it. I think we were the only ones who played PSP back in the day. So maybe a more modern version that some of you might know is like Jellicoe Worlds, which has like a similar principle. And fortunately, the creator of Jellicoe Worlds, it's called Tim Fitzrandolph. He has an amazing YouTube video, which is like dives really deeply into how he made it happen. And for us, it was like, oh, this is amazing. We see all the wobbly elements, we see the bouncy car. This is like perfect for us. This is exactly what we need. So what we did then is like we checked, okay, what does Godot offer for us? Well, it's a start, I assume, so let's see. We were confronted basically by the reality of like different types of physics engines. So the one that is most common in game engines is the one on the right. It's a rigid body physics engine, which just means like it's just solid bodies that are colliding. And the other one, I actually didn't even find if it has a proper name. We call it sticks and dots, which you can see on the left, which is the one I showed. And basically, the main difference is here you have lines and dots connected, and you can choose settings so that the line isn't a fixed length. So it's much easier to make something wobbly or distorting and stretch. It's much harder in a rigid body physics engine. So it might appear clear what we chose, but the reality, as everybody from you know, is like making games is really hard. Making physics engines is really hard. So we thought, okay, we have to come up with a proper solution, maybe something math-based to come to a decision. And it was like, okay, we'd rather do one hard thing than two hard things, and we probably can make it happen in any case. One big thing we wanted to check first, because we wanted to have these kind of organic shapes and levels, we also checked like, okay, what does Godot support that we can use? So shout out already to the maintainers and the creators of Smart Shape 2D. It's like an amazing tool to create like more organic shapes. I think it's been shown a few times in the GodotCon because it's so popular, and I can just recommend it. Maybe even join the Discord. The people are really nice there and help out if you have any questions. But as you can see from the GIF, essentially you have like Bezier curves, like you can do organic lines, and then similar to a tile set, basically you can say what kind of properties does it have, what is the border, what is the main body, so you can really easily make really nice looking levels really quickly. It's actually quite close to the Rayman Legends, probably many of you know, the UbiArt engine. So of course not as sophisticated, but for our case it's really great. And we also try to contribute there to get it even better. And I have to say, without this, our game probably wouldn't exist at all, so we're really glad it exists. And the second, probably most complicated thing we had to solve and before we decided to go all in the game is the character controller. Because what you normally do in Godot is you use the character body 2D. It's like, it's perfect for doing games that require really precise controls, for example, like a platformer like Celeste, because you have full control over the behavior. But it kind of acts like an immovable force in the world, so when it collides with something, it doesn't move at all, which you can guess is the exact opposite of what we want. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have like a rigid body 2D. It's basically the normal objects of the physics engine that fall around. They're simulated and controlled by the physics engine. and like technically you can use it for a character controller, but if you're applying impulses and stuff, it feels more like controlling a rocket with thrusters, and like we want to have like some nice controls. So the question was for us like, okay, what is somewhere in between that we can harness? So like something that is responsive to control but is also interacting with the world. And interestingly enough, we discovered this fairly late. We still use the rigid body because it has a function. It's called integrate forces. And it allows you to customize the behavior of the physics engine without breaking it. Because normally, if you try to do some weird unnatural behavior, everything breaks and it glitches. And here, for example, if you say, oh, I have my character, it gets hit by something, it might move a little bit because it gets like some velocity. Then you can say, okay, I'm going to take this velocity, I'm going to change it a bit. So I'm going to apply some acceleration there, which is probably the exact same code behind it which you would use for the normal character controller. But then you reapply it to the linear velocity, and now you have like the nice behavior you want in combination with working really nicely with the physics engine. So you can see it here. It's basically like a interesting interaction. So like the boxes have weight, but you can still pull them around. But if it falls down, it has like velocity, and it's like a really interesting push and pull tension between the character and the environment, which was really important for our game. So it's not just a one-way interaction, basically. And what you have also seen already there is like that our character is kind of wobbly. So this wobbliness is normally called a soft body because it's a body that is deformable, obviously. The problem is it is the exact opposite of a rigid body. And since, if you remember, we have a rigid body physics engine, so it doesn't really go hand in hand. And like the most common approach you can see up there, it's essentially like many rigid bodies that are connected by springs. So when you look at the video, we kind of see, okay, it deforms as expected. And if we would imagine we draw a line around it and a shape, then it works really nicely. But the problem is there, mainly the player and the game, because if you would use this as your solution, then and crazy stuff happens in your game, it could get deformed to a point where it's like basically, for example, some things might flip the other way around, and it's in that broken state for the entire time. So you need something more robust. And actually, the Jellycar Worlds has a really nice solution. So you can see on the right, has the same principle of having like the dots, which in our case would be rigid bodies. They're connected with springs, but they're not connected to each other with springs. They're connected to like an original shape behind it. So no matter how badly deformed the thing gets, it always gets pulled back to the correct state that we want. And if you look at this here, we can see that our body is basically made out of like a lot of smaller circles. And what you can see behind it a little bit is like this gray area. So this gray area is a rigid body that we use to control. So we actually technically we don't control the soft body. We control it with the principle I just showed. And then the soft body stuff is attached to it, and they work really nicely together. So no matter what you do with the player and the controller, it will always work nicely to snap back into the shape we want, basically. For us, this wasn't enough because we wanted to have like some really nice worlds. So you can imagine like, okay, if the body is kind of soft, it would be also really cool to have like worlds that are soft, but it requires a little bit of a different technique. So if you look at this, here you can imagine like a world made of jelly or the insides of an animal or whatever world that could be built with this. And you might think, oh, Stefan, this looks kind of sophisticated and complex. But if you remember the slide from before, we chose one hard, not two hard. So if I show you behind the curtain, it's a really cheap trick. It's just like basically a few rigid bodies connected with some joints, and then we use a Bezier curve to draw around it, and really cheaply trick you into thinking we actually did better work than we did there. One problem, however, I encountered in all of those things, and actually for this talk I did the proper research because until 2 weeks ago I still didn't understand the behavior correctly. So in Godot you have like two things. You have collision layers and collision masks. And collision layers are basically in which universe the thing exists. So in our setup we have a ball, a yellow ball, and we have a blue platform there. So basically the yellow ball, in this case, it exists in the universe 1 and the other in universe 2. And we have masks, which is basically, okay, in which universe do you look for collisions and behavior? And I have now different setups, and I will go through them in a little bit. But basically, when we start the animation, then this is what will happen. So we can kind of see we have like 3 different kinds of behaviors. We can kind of guess which ones we want. We want the ones in the center. And the question is like, okay, it's basically the same setup. Why does it not work? If we go through them, it's like the first case, I mean, we kind of want them to collide, so it doesn't make sense, but it works as expected. So they're in 2 parallel universes. They don't know about each other, so they don't do anything. Technically works, but it's not what we want. The second one is like a ticking time bomb, so you should never use this approach, because what we did there is like we put the ball in both collision layers and both mask layers, so it technically now collides with the platform, but the problem is this is like a really messy setup. So once your project grows in complexity, you want to have like really clear setup of collision layers and mask, which I'll also show in a bit. This is the devil, because you think, it works, it collides, but it doesn't really, and then you spend half an hour debugging your logic that you set up, and then it's like, oh no, I just forgot this one toggle to set with the collision mask, and that's why it doesn't work. And so this is the case you want. You want to have clear separation in the collision layers, and if there should be interaction, they should have basically overlapping collision masks. To me, this was super hard to kind of understand why this is the case. So I tried to come up with a better visualization for it. So we have the setup we just had with the devil, basically. That's the devil setup. And I imagine it now in how do you perceive the thing, basically. So the first thing is that we have the player's reality. Of course, the player sees everything that is on screen. And the second one, we have the ball's reality. It looks kind of similar to the player's reality. And we have the platform's reality, but it only sees itself. And it actually does make sense if you look at the layers and masks. So the ball checks parallel universe number 1 and 2. So it sees both things, but the platform only checks one, so it doesn't know what is going on. And that's why that's the reason why the ball can react to the platform, but the platform cannot react to the ball. And this is why we have this somewhat broken, somewhat working behavior that is going on. And when it comes to the setup we have for our collision layers and mask, these are currently the ones we have. It's actually not too many. And you can split them basically up in what they do. So we have basically a few layers only we use for static bodies, a few we only use for rigid bodies, and a few we use for area 2Ds. I mean, they're kind of self-explanatory to some extent. So world is just a level geometry. Ghost barriers is something, for example, our character cannot pass through, but the rest. Then rigid bodies is all the kind of objects and things that are flying around and colliding with the world and the stuff. And then we use many area 2Ds, basically just to check things, what is colliding with what and stuff like that. We have essentially 3 rules how to make this like work nicely. So for example, the rule 1 is like in 99% of the cases, the object is only in one layer, but it can be in many masks. I will show an example as well in a second. The rule 2 is kind of a bit abstract, but what are, or not the third one on this abstract is like what are the things. So it's just like clean coding. If the soft bodies call the layer soft bodies, be fairly granular. So even like 3 months later, you still know what it does basically. And this is the abstract one, basically what gets checked. And I have to elaborate a little bit. If we take the example or the layer with the bombables, it's basically, okay, we have bombs in our game. So we have things that can be bombed, obviously. And for our case, it's like if the bomb goes off, it checks, did the explosion hit anything that is bombable? And if so, trigger that state change that it collapses, basically. So technically, we could have also a collision layer that is called bombs. But since the bomb itself checks the other things that are colliding with it, so it makes more sense for us to have like a bombables layer instead of a bombs layer. And we were tempted at sometimes to have like both bombs and bombables, but that just led to inconsistencies. So we tried to think clearly about like, okay, what is affecting the logic of the object, and then name it accordingly, basically. So this is the typical setup of our node structure. This is like the bomb we basically stole from Wind Waker. And if you look on the left, you can see, okay, it's a rigid body essentially with some other stuff that you can ignore for the sake of the explanation here. And what you can see on the right is like, okay, it is just in one physics layer, so it's just an object like any other object that exists, but it is in many masks because it should not fall through the world. It can interact with background objects to make them like fly around a little bit. It will collide with other objects, with soft bodies and with the hero's soft bodies. And all the other layers, it doesn't matter. So you have like a really clean and predictable setup of what is going to happen. I'm going to show you one illegal technique. So don't tell the maintainers that I showed you this. We call it the dark matter technique because in a lot of cases, we actually have a physics body that has no shape or layers or weight. It feels really, really bad because you have your UI there that is telling you that this is not great. But what we do it for is basically, for example, we have this bouncer kind of thing. If the hero touches it, you get pushed away. So you need kind of to mount it somewhere. But as you can see, it's floating basically in midair. So like, where do you mount it? You could now select some world geometry, but it's much easier to have like some kind of anchor body that doesn't need to do anything its own, but we can use the spring to connect it to, and then it works. However, there's one side effect. So if you open any file and turn around, there's like it's gonna be hiding and looking at you meanly. One thing we really wanted to have in our game is like a King Arthur style sword pulling thing. But the problem is rigid body physics engines really don't like having things being stuck in each other. So if you would try that, they get pushed apart. So we have something called a rippable connection, which you can see on the top right. And essentially, it's like a fancy version of connecting an object to a joint. So for example, you could connect two objects with each other. But we added some other behaviors there, so we could allow this behavior that we want. So what you see, if the sword is stuck, technically the sword doesn't have any collision with anything. It's basically just held in place by some joint that is created by this rippable connection. If you pull it too far, as you can see, then the joint gets removed, so you can move it freely, but in the moment that it's still stuck, it's basically held by the joint. And what you can see on the top right, there's like a collision area below the anchor kind of thing. And this basically is a copy of the sword shape, and it moves alongside the sword. So if you pull out the sword that has no collision, you also pull out the area 2D, and the area 2D tracks, am I still touching the ground or not? And the moment it doesn't touch the ground anymore, it turns on the sword's collision again, and now it seems like, okay, you pull something out and it can interact with the world as it would normally do. We have some more fancy things, like we have settings like to lock rotation and direction you can pull it from, but the basic principle and the most complicated principle was the one I just described. So what is often a problem in physics engines is like you see the cool cool physics logic, but in a game you won't really have to have interactivity, so you kind of need to have sound. And also what we also wanted to have is like the braking behavior. This is unfortunately not built into Godot, but whenever we use a rigid body, we use our custom rigid body, and it has some specs. So basically it has you can add a sound there, you can have some specs when it's braking, and we use the velocity instead of the impulse to track that behavior, because it's a bit more reliable to work with. But essentially you have the bump speed there, for example, so when it bumps with a certain velocity into something, then it triggers a sound. It also triggers an event, and also braking. It basically doesn't do anything on its own. It just triggers the signal, the event is triggered, and then you can do whatever we want with it. For example, with the vase, they know that they have to brake on the signal, and then they do that. And now some quick rapid fire ones for the conclusion. So you have to harness the level design, because if you have listened closely or have worked with it before, for example, our soft body, if you would have like a tiny object, it would just pass through it. So it's like, no, not gonna have tiny objects in our game. It's just gonna be big objects. You can also harness game design, so you don't want to have any soft locking going on. It's especially risky in physics games. So we said, okay, we're gonna have like a Zelda-style mechanic where if you leave the room and enter the room, most stuff resets, especially except for some certain important things. So if something would go crazy, it's a high chance you can fix it by just going out and in again. The node order matters, especially for the spring joints, because you can connect some things off-center. So if you accidentally select the wrong node for node A or node B, you get really weird behavior that is really hard to understand sometimes. So just make sure you connect the right thing with the right thing. Freezing is possible for rigid bodies. So for example, for our bombable walls, oh no, okay. Freezing is possible for the rigid bodies. So for example, our bombable walls, they're not static. They're rigid bodies that are frozen and then get unfrozen and they can do whatever they want. And the pin joints are actually really cool. They got softness introduced a while ago, which means they can now kind of behave a bit like spring joints, and they're much more reliable in our experience. So whenever we just want to pin something in a soft way to, for example, the wall, we use actually a pin joint instead of a spring joint. And the last one, the two ones, sometimes the joints are not strong enough. So for example, when you have a really heavy object, one joint isn't enough. It feels kind of dirty. We can just spawn multiple joints and it works. And what we had to learn also is like avoid the realism trap. Is like when you have a physics engine, you're kind of tempted to build it how it is in reality, but you should, as normally in games, you should take a step back and think of what you want to achieve with it, how it should feel like, and then try to model that in the physics engine. Yeah, we have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes for questions. I will be around today anyways, but I wanted to thank you for showing up, and I'm looking forward for your questions.
Hi, I have a question about the forces that you apply. Are those just float values, and do you tinker around until they work, or do you build some kind of dynamic value type or anything? Like, how do you make sure that all the forces align?
In which context, for example?
When you have a weight that pulls on a spring and the spring can break at a certain point, like, are those just floating values that you align until it kind of works, or?
Essentially, yes. I would lie if I would tell otherwise.
So first of all, kudos on the game because it looks really satisfying.
Thanks.
I was like, you said that it's usually 99% of the cases you want to have one layer for each object. So do you reckon there's a use case for a physics object that has 0 physics layers? Like, does it sound like a super bad idea?
It depends. So, for example, the thing I showed, that like the dark matter technique, it technically doesn't have layers, but since it doesn't have a body as well, it doesn't do anything. What we use often where it doesn't have layers is area to Ds, because we often just want to track when something goes in, but not the other way around. So this is a case we often have there.
Very good presentation. Thank you. I have a question regarding complexity. So the more things you add, you might want to check that nothing has broken or something works together, like in terms of systems, when you introduce something new. How do you test that? Do you have any kind of automation approach?
Unfortunately, not yet. So it might seem more ahead. The game might seem more advanced than it actually is currently. So we try to make a fairly modular approach. That's why I also encourage to make the collision layer set up really well, because it's kind of how can I say? It's a bit like the Legend of Zelda chemistry engine, what it's called. So it stays kind of predictable, but we will definitely need some kind of system to do that. What we right now have is basically just a big room where many of the odd cases happen and test it there, and it works so far, but later we will probably need something more sophisticated.